Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be covering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators since the NAFSA conference last week in Denver, Colorado. So we hope you're all rested and recovered from your exploits at the conference. I know for me, it was one of the more fulfilling weeks of my year. Every year when NAFSA has been in person, it's been kind of the one area I look forward to more conference I look forward to more than anything else, just because of the volume of people. And even though there were only 6,000 out of a traditional 12,000 person conference the last time it was in DC in 2019, even though it was only half full, I think everyone who was there really benefited incredibly by the conversations that were had, and what an incredible week. And hopefully you're rested and recharged and ready for what's ahead in international education as we move into the summer here in the Northern Hemisphere. So as we do each week, for those not familiar with the Roundup, we take our stories from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays, on Monday mornings. And that is called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And that's social media and international education news. That's what we do here at SMIE Consulting, and is the foundation of what we share in that newsletter. We bring 5 or 6 stories on the social media side, 15, 20 stories on the international ed side, and oftentimes where those overlap. And we talk about them in the newsletter, our hot takes on the news stories of the day. But we also take the chance through our roundup here on Wednesdays, we go a little bit more in depth into the kind of the key topics of the day. So I posted all the links to our website where you can subscribe to the newsletter, the most recent edition that comes out if you subscribe through the website, and also the LinkedIn version of that newsletter. So I encourage you to subscribe if you're not already. So you can get that news on Monday mornings, so that by the time Wednesday rolls around, you have a pretty good idea on what we might be talking about today on the Roundup. So let's get right into our first story. And the question is, what does the future hold for aggregators? And this has been a particularly keen, important question and conversation to have on many college campuses that have been perhaps working with educational agents for a number of years or exploring that for the first time. You're being thrown a number of different topics like agent aggregators and super agents and master agents and sub agents, and kind of understanding what the landscape is. And these agent aggregators fall into categories that are primarily, I think you will see with most of the agent aggregators out there, tend to be more tech-based, platform-based systems. You look at your Reply boards, your Educos, the Adventus, maybe getting the study portals, but they're not really an agency, super agent. Or agent aggregator. They have a portal, but they charge agent rates for students that matriculate from them. So that's all in that category on agent aggregators. You look at what they do, and the reason I bring this question up today is there was an article in University World News called "Return to Normality. Is it crunch time for aggregators?" And one of the authors of the article, both Louise Nickel and Alan Priest, I've gotten to know over the last couple of years with some of their work and research on everything from agents to the war in Ukraine and the topics that impact international education, obviously. But they argue in the piece that as a result of NAFSA returning in person, as a result of things returning to new normals, whatever that looks like, you think about what parents, what students are eager to do more of in the coming year, more that for the next class of students coming up that are going to be making decisions on where to go for university. The questions that they're asking are perhaps best answered in person. That they would prefer to have the in-person opportunities to talk about their college plans, and that organizations like agent aggregators that rely so heavily on the tech side of things to make their business tick over and make their keep their agents happy that are sending their students to them, to their platform. You wonder if these aggregators will still have the cachet now that it may no longer be essential to do everything online. And that's the balance is always the rub when it comes to finding that right mix internationally in your recruitment strategy. For most, before aggregators existed, you did your recruitment one of three ways. You relied solely on armchair recruitment by working on social media. You worked on online presence, driving people to your site and having conversations that way because you didn't have the budget to travel. You potentially did in-country travel where you would go on recruitment tours, but there's a limit to how much you can do, how many countries you could get to, and budget obviously limits that altogether. So that is a second option. A third option is having in-country representation. And that can be done a number of different ways, and agents have grown into one of the major ways U.S. institutions and other countries around the world are doing this as well, using in-country reps to either through agents, through alumni, through hires of the university. Third parties can have hire in-country reps for you to manage your application and interests from students in particular countries or regions. So all those are different models of in-country representation. And you might have a mix of all three. And the healthy institutions probably have been doing it a while, see value in not only having institutional reps go to visit certain regions, certain countries, having a robust digital presence, social media to do the armchair recruitment, as well as having in-country representation. Obviously, you can't have that everywhere. No agency even has offices everywhere, but you can get a fairly broad spectrum of countries represented through agents. Now, what aggregators do is something different because as an institution, you're not working directly with students. You're working through, or you may be working directly with students once they apply. And aggregators will make the pitch that the real benefit of what they do is that they're sending you qualified applications. You're only going to get those that are truly interested in your institution and not get a lot of fluff. The reality might be different depending on your institution. You might be flooded with applications right now, depending on what the sources of those are. Some might be from agents, some might be from aggregators, some might be from institutional partners, whatever. But there may be a lot of fluff in there. And you need to figure out for your own institution what that mix is. Where's that fluff coming from? If it's a huge time suck for your staff, if it's taking away resources from that could be devoted to better enrolling the students that are serious about your institution and finding that mix, then that's something you need to do. So the article that Louise and Alan wrote really talks about that these study portals, these algorithms, the use of artificial intelligence, blockchain, machine learning, all of these things that they say are potentially suffering the same fate as masks and social distancing. They were essential, and this quote from the article, they were essential and sometimes mandated during the early part of the pandemic, but are now, in many cases, matters of choice, and in some countries have become very much second best to personal contact. And I would say that in many cases that is the case. That in the best case scenario, which we had before the pandemic, if you can call it that, to what we're moving to with this new normal, is people still prefer, as is evidence from the NAFSA conference, they prefer to meet in person. That they prefer to have those interactions where the real business can get done, that where the real understanding can take place. And that is something that's right now, with the need for more in-person, the need and desire to engage with humans and particularly representatives of institutions, that is an overriding drive, I think. And that may or may not have an impact on how successful aggregators will be that are entirely based on platform decisions, platform presence. So we'll see what happens with this, and I think the competition will come most in the next few years from those that from the high tech companies that have invested so much in AI and blockchain and machine learning and all of this. we'll see a conflict between high tech and high touch. And they make the point in the article here that you look at what's happened with some of the pathway providers over the years and how they have gone big, and then they've seen some serious retractions. The pandemic certainly impacted that. They've been forced to change their models, business models, on how they do things. These pathway providers relied on huge networks of agents to funnel students into their pathway programs in the various countries that they operate. So we'll see what happens with this, but when you look at it from a human perspective, from a student perspective, that yes, hopefully you will have guidance from these platforms that will get a list of places that they can apply to and be successful in, but you don't always get that if it's impersonal. If you're going to really have a conversation with a student and get to know them as an agent might, or as a counselor might, as a particular representative for an institution, getting to know a student well and have a face-to-face conversation. What does that look like? We'll see what happens, but there's going to be some real gaps that will spring up in these high-tech models that can't be replicated elsewhere. That can't be replaced, I should say. Those gaps can't be replaced with technology. So in a newer environment where there are more options open and more and students will vote with their feet. Will they vote with their feet to go to an in-person agent or in-country representative, or will they vote with their fingers and click away on to high-tech platforms that will get them answers quickly and easily, and perhaps in some ways quicker and more refined and less effort, perhaps. But we'll see where that will all shake out. Now, what will be interesting to see is in the future for these aggregators. And again, I'm working with institutions that work with aggregators, work with master agents, super agents, mom and pop shop agents, ARC certified agent groups. So I know the playing field has gotten very diverse and very muddied, frankly, and it's hard to really distinguish between one group of actors and others sometimes, and what category do you fit into? Having those conversations last week at NAFSA with different agent groups, and sometimes they don't necessarily want to share or want to be able to be pigeonholed that way. And how they distinguish themselves is always going to be the real selling point. So a very fascinating topic of agent aggregators and what their future may be now that we're returning to normal. But closely related to that is the second question of the day. And that is one that is particularly important for me because I've been on both sides of this. And is there a talent war in international education right now? There was a Pi News article that I've just dropped the link in the chat on Facebook and YouTube, and I'll do that later on LinkedIn and Twitter. But this article really helps kind of summarize a lot of what's happened during the pandemic with departures from the institutional side, and there are lots of different reasons. There's a lot of institutions that, when the pandemic hit, they realized they were going to need to tighten some belts, and they realized international enrollments were going to be impacted negatively. They cut international staff. Oftentimes they would cut senior staff, and you had a number of institutions that lost decades of experience and leadership in international education during the pandemic. Some were forced early retirements. Some were forced. Some were really sad cases where the person might have passed away from COVID or have serious health complications because of COVID, because they got it. But the reality is, what's happened, though there has been a lot of leadership and experience that's been lost from the institutional side in international education, particularly on the student recruitment side. I could say, I'm sure my colleagues on education abroad side would say the same thing. But when you look at just for example, last week at NAFSA, 6,000 people there, 40% of those that were attending were first-timers. First-time NAFSA attendees, 40% of that population that attended that conference. And that speaks volumes, frankly. We know, obviously, travel restrictions impacted a number of countries, particularly China, who basically sent 5 people, and those people had been living outside of China since the pandemic began, so they were able to come. But there weren't any Chinese institutions represented. There was no China Pavilion. CEAIE wasn't represented in the exhibit hall or in the attendee list. They just didn't send anybody. And that's a huge loss for international education in an environment where China obviously is the #1 sender of students abroad. You see what's happened in the U.S. With the folks that have left the profession entirely or changed dramatic roles at their institutions to maybe keep a small finger in the international pie, but it's not what they do anymore, predominantly. You see, on the other side of the coin, you see a lot of the smarter ed tech firms that have been flooding the market on the service provider side have hoovered up, in the British slang, hoovered up the best talent, and there's been some of that as well. So you've had these forced departures, you've had early retirements, you've had education companies, service provider companies kind of hiring out some of these people that have left their positions or were lured away because of opportunities that they provided in the private sector, and going to the dark side. It has its appeals on face value, and for some people, getting outside of the bureaucracy of institutions, you just end up having to deal with a different kind of bureaucracy within ed tech firms or other companies that have different expectations and reporting and sales goals and all that wonderful stuff that you have to deal with on that side. So the talent war is real. And I think institutions have been on the losing side of that talent war for a number of years. And this goes back 15, 20 years, really. When you started to see in the early 2000s, post 9/11, you started to see, for example, the expo hall at NAFSA would increasingly grow and grow, not just beyond the study consortium sites or booths or the country pavilions, whatever you might have. You started to see every type of service provider, from study abroad service providers to international student services providers to all sorts of recruitment providers. Recruitment service providers offering their services through the expo hall. It became a very commercial business, and that's the reality of international education over the last 20 years. It has fundamentally changed. That the reality is these service providers can now, and often do, and they fill roles that previously were done exclusively by institutions. And that's happened as a result of institutions who have, frankly, cut staff in international offices or recruitment offices to the point where they don't have the internal expertise or budget to do everything themselves. That's just not physically possible in most cases anymore. You've seen institutions that have, over the past 2 years, we've had 2 major East Coast institutions cut their entire international recruitment staff. In the case of Johnson & Wales a couple of years ago, they cut their entire recruitment staff, international staff. Kind of got out of that part of the game for a while. Then just this past month, you had Southern New Hampshire University that had heavily invested in staff that were working remote to recruit international students. 5 or 6 people were cut, lost their jobs as a result of maybe poor decisions at the institutional level. I don't know. But when you see colleagues repeatedly burned by institutions deciding to get out, you can understand why they might be lured by the dark side to the service provider side. Because the reality is there's a need that these service providers fill and meet, where institutions might have once done it on their own. They can't anymore. They don't have the bandwidth internally, and certainly staff-wise, budget-wise, what it would take for them to replicate what these service providers can do for a fraction of the cost, or a good percentage of the cost, depending on the provider. You see that these providers are meeting a need in the market. And that will always be there now, because I don't see the pendulum swinging all the way back over to fully staffed international offices that can do everything in-house. That just frankly isn't possible anymore. The world's too big. and there are too many opportunities and too many markets, and no one person or one group of people will really have the expertise to get all of that done themselves. So the talent war is real in international ed, and it's not getting any prettier. Certainly, some of I mentioned institutions that have cut staff. There's also been service providers that have, during the pandemic especially, pathway providers had cut half. One of the major U.S. pathway providers cut more than half their staff a couple times in 2018 and then again in 2020. You've seen one provider that was particularly strong in India, offering in-country representation and hiring staff for that purpose to manage student interest there. You see them cutting a number of their staff in the weeks leading up to NAFSA. So where they didn't even have a presence at NAFSA this year. So there's a lot of that going on, and it's something that I think there's attrition on both sides. The pandemic's impacted everybody differently, but on the institutional level and on the service provider level, you've seen some real carnage, frankly, and it's not going to end anytime soon. Maybe there's going to be some stabilization in the next year or two, but there's a lot of dead wood in there that will get shook out on the service provider side and probably on the institutional side still, as smaller players that were vainly holding on hope that they could bring in a class and keep things ticking over on the international side are going to probably do what a number of institutions did during the pandemic and cut staff again. So it's a sad state of affairs, but a reality that we're all facing, and one that I think it's going to be with us for a while, and the fallout from the pandemic is going to have, well, just like long COVID, there's some people and some institutions, some businesses that are going to be feeling the impacts of the pandemic for years. The ones that will thrive are the ones that can move quickly, can make the right hires and invest in the right people, and have a good balance of internal and external help to get things done. It's a mystery mix and a recipe to get that done right, but those who can are certainly going to be ahead of the game in that respect. So yes, there is a talent war, and it is not over, and it's not pretty. But let's move on to our final question of the day, and that has to do with our friends in New Zealand. New Zealand has had kind of an underdog story for a number of years. They have been kind of a little engine that could. They're not, have never been a huge destination in terms of physical numbers. I think they got up to maybe 30,000 at one point, international students studying in New Zealand. But they've never they don't have the capacity, frankly. There are 8 institutions and a number of voc-tech schools or polytechnics. So you really are in a situation in New Zealand where there's limited numbers that they can handle in terms of institutional capacity for international students. They have, back in the day, probably going back 7, 8, 9, 10 years, they were actually they had a very coordinated national effort. Education New Zealand launched, and there was recruitment strategies, that investment in promotional campaigns, and really driving interest to New Zealand as maybe a friendlier Australia destination, comparing to their other colleagues down under. But you saw with the Kiwis a real friendliness and a real focus on personalization and quality that you probably weren't going to get anywhere else. And that had great appeal. They have one of the safest, one of the least corrupt governments and countries in the world. So that has particular appeal. They use that in their marketing. I used to do quarterly reports for my colleagues at the British Council IELTS on how each country was perceived and what some of their benefits were. And certainly the peace and being peaceful and being one of the least corrupt countries in the world, that had appeal, and that was always something that resonated with future student markets. But what you see now with New Zealand, they were in a really strong groove in the teens, 2000s, and they've really built up their reputation. But what has happened? And the pandemic has, like I said earlier, it has impacted countries very differently depending on how their governments responded, depending on how institutions could respond, if they had any control over what was said or what directions the country was going. But you look at New Zealand now. I've posted a couple stories. One was about the reopening of New Zealand's borders. And that's right, New Zealand's borders have not yet reopened to international students. They have had a couple of trials of 50 students here, 50 students there. Seemed to go well. They went through quarantine and all the rigmarole that you had to go through back while the pandemic was still raging. But they are not opening their borders until July 31st. July 31st. And what they've done is they've set a limit of 5,000 students in this first tranche of returning students, and that's who they give priority to, returning students to who are looking to get back in country to finish their degrees. Students who've been outside the country for the last 2.5 years. What's happened in New Zealand is you see their academic year starts February, March. So they shut down right at the beginning of the pandemic and haven't had new international students in since. Those that were locked out and hadn't gotten back in yet, they're the ones that are being in the first tranche of returnees are coming starting in July 31st, after July 31st when the borders reopen. The problem is they have gotten only 10% of those 5,000 spots filled by students wanting to return, in terms of those that have gone through the visa process and gotten their documents updated. So we're looking at less than 10% of the 5,000. So less than 500 international students have made plans to return to New Zealand after July 31st when the borders reopen. That's embarrassing. And you look at what's happened, and I've talked about this regularly on the Roundup in terms of the impact of closed borders beyond what were happening in other Western countries. And you look, we've seen what's happened in Australia. They've not gotten nearly the volume that they were expecting when they reopened in February. You see China's still closed. They're doing little groups of 50 or 200 coming back in to finish their studies, approving them, but not necessarily letting them enter yet. Just saw something from China that Duke Kunshan, for the first time, will have 100 students able to return to complete their studies or continue their studies. So those three countries, China, Australia, New Zealand, have had significant reputational damage done because they delayed reopening. There's a lot of other issues in the mix in Australia in terms of employment, in terms of vocational students kind of coming only for employment and only a pathway to residency rather than education, even caring about getting their education. So there's a lot that's going on in a myriad of issues, but you see the three countries that have been slowest to open have the ones who are reputationally suffering now and will have lingering impacts for years to come. Australia, maybe 3-4 years before they get back up to where they need to be pre-pandemic. You see New Zealand, they're looking 2030. Some of their prognosticators said early on that's how long it's going to take them to recover. China, who knows how long it's going to take them to recover, because they have done themselves no favors with their zero COVID policy. And what's happened in Shanghai that seems to be easing up now, the damage has already been done. And you have not only international students there are still some that want to return and finish their degree because they want to finish what they started. They value what they can get out of their education there, but there are those that are turned off completely because they can't. They might have wanted to start their studies in China for the last 2.5 years, but aren't going to be able to in any real way until 2023 at the earliest. So we're seeing a lot of challenges in countries that have decided to reopen late, and New Zealand is certainly not immune from those challenges. They handled the pandemic really well early on, got a lot of high praise for it, as did China, for what at least the West could see of what was going on in China. You see what's happening now with New Zealand, and it's sad. You've seen some reactions against international post-pandemic that now the government is focusing And this statement, I think, tells you everything you need to know about where New Zealand's headed right now. They're focusing on value over volume, or quality over quantity, in terms of for international students, because they've had pushback by locals that are not wanting the country to invest so heavily and open so many doors for international students to work after they're done with their studies. So that's a big deal, and that will have some long-lasting complications for them. So sorry to hear that from my Kiwi friends, but I wish you all the best as you struggle through this and try to get back to some sense of normalcy. But that's all we have for you today on the Midweek Roundup. We really appreciate you being a part of the conversation. And for those that we met last week in NAFSA, thank you for being a part of that journey. Hopefully you've recovered and recharged your batteries for the battles ahead. And we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. So until next week, we wish you all the very best and have a wonderful day. Cheers.